In the early years of the 20th century, Europe stood at the center of the world. Its empires ruled oceans and continents. Its industries powered the global economy, and its armies marched beneath banners that had flown for centuries. Yet beneath this surface of power and confidence, old rivalries, unresolved grievances, and rising ideologies were already preparing the ground for the greatest catastrophe in human history. The First World War had shattered the old order. Empires collapsed. Borders were redrawn. Millions of young men lay buried in fields from Flanders to Galicia. The Treaty of Versailles ended the fighting, but it did not bring peace. It imposed humiliation on Germany, stripped it of territory, limited its military, and burdened it with massive reparations. Many Germans did not accept defeat. They believed they had been betrayed. In the years that followed, Germany descended into political chaos and economic collapse. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Unemployment spread across cities and villages. Veterans returned to a society that no longer had a place for them. Street battles between communists, nationalists, and paramilitary groups became common. Out of this chaos rose a former corporal from Austria. Adolf Hitler was not born into power. He had no noble blood, no military command, no political office. He had been a failed artist, a homeless drifter in Vienna, and a messenger in the trenches of the First World War. But he possessed something far more dangerous, an absolute belief in his destiny and an ability to speak to the anger and despair of a defeated nation. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he dismantled democracy. Political opponents were arrested. Trade unions were dissolved. Newspapers were silenced. Germany became a dictatorship. The Nazi Party became the state. The state became the party. Hitler promised to restore German pride. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. He promised to build a new empire that would dominate Europe for 1,000 years. And millions believed him. Across Europe, the political balance was shifting. Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini had already embarked on a path of conquest. In the East, the Soviet Union was undergoing rapid industrialization under Joseph Stalin, while executing millions in purges and collectivization campaigns. In Spain, civil war raged between Republicans and nationalists, becoming a testing ground for modern warfare. The world was moving toward another war. In 1936, Hitler sent German troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. France and Britain protested, but they did not act. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Again, there was no resistance. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. At Munich, Britain and France agreed to his demands in the hope of preserving peace. They believed they had avoided war. They were wrong. In March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The illusion was shattered. Hitler had no intention of stopping. His next target was Poland. Germany demanded the return of the city of Danzig and a corridor through Polish territory. Poland refused. Britain and France promised to defend Polish independence. Europe stood on the edge. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union stunned the world by signing a non-aggression pact. In secret, they agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. 1 week later, the storm broke. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. The Luftwaffe bombed cities and railways. Panzer divisions smashed through defenses. Infantry followed in trucks and half-tracks. This was a new kind of war, fast, brutal, and relentless. Blitzkrieg. Poland fought bravely, but it stood alone. On September 17th, the Red Army invaded from the east. Caught between two giants, Poland collapsed. Warsaw fell. The Second World War had begun. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but they were unprepared for modern warfare. For months, little happened on the Western Front. It became known as the Phony War. Then, in the spring of 1940, Hitler struck. German forces swept through Denmark and Norway. In May, they attacked the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Allied armies rushed forward, only to be outflanked through the Ardennes forest. Panzer divisions burst through at Sedan and raced toward the Channel. Within weeks, the French army collapsed. Paris fell. France surrendered. Only Britain remained. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force in preparation for invasion. The skies over southern England became a battlefield. Radar stations, fighter bases, and cities were bombed. London burned. But Britain did not fall. The German invasion was postponed. Hitler turned east. In June 1941, he launched the greatest invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa. More than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Thousands of tanks rolled forward. The Luftwaffe destroyed Soviet aircraft on the ground. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and annihilated. The Red Army reeled backward. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Cities fell one after another. Kiev, Smolensk, Minsk. German columns advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. It seemed that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. But the war was only beginning. By the end of 1941, the war that had begun in Europe had spread across the globe. What started as a regional conflict had become a struggle between empires on every continent. Armies marched across deserts and jungles. Fleets clashed in distant oceans. Cities burned from London to Leningrad, from Hamburg to Tokyo. The fate of nations was now bound together in a single, colossal conflict. When German forces crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, Hitler believed that the campaign would be over within months. The Red Army, he was convinced, would collapse under the weight of the German blitzkrieg just as Poland and France had done before it. The invasion force was the largest ever assembled. More than 3 million soldiers, over 3,000 tanks, and thousands of aircraft. The initial results seemed to confirm his confidence. German armored spearheads drove deep into Soviet territory. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Millions of prisoners were marched westward. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. German troops advanced toward Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine in the south. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Factories were dismantled and moved beyond the Ural Mountains. Millions of civilians were evacuated eastward. Entire new armies were raised. The Red Army absorbed the blows and continued to fight. By the autumn of 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow. The city prepared for evacuation. Government offices packed their archives. Bridges were mined. Many believed the capital would fall. Then winter came. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees. German soldiers lacked winter clothing. Weapons froze. Vehicles broke down. Horses died in their harnesses. Soviet troops, reinforced by fresh Siberian divisions, counterattacked. The German advance stopped. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been halted. In December 1941, the war expanded even further. Japan, already fighting in China, launched a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned in the harbor. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. More than 2,000 Americans were killed. The United States entered the war. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The conflict became truly global. In the Pacific, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia. Hong Kong fell. Singapore surrendered. The Philippines were overrun. Japanese troops advanced toward India and Australia. Across North Africa, German and Italian forces under General Erwin Rommel pushed eastward toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. The British fought desperately to hold the line. In the Atlantic, German U-boats sank Allied shipping at an alarming rate. Merchant convoys burned from the Arctic to the Caribbean. By 1942, the Axis powers appeared unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the balance of power was shifting. The industrial strength of the United States began to transform the Allied war effort. American factories produced tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition in quantities the Axis could never match. The Soviet Union rebuilt its shattered forces. Britain, battered but unbroken, tightened its grip on the seas. The year 1942 would become the turning point. In the Pacific, the United States struck back at Midway. In June, American carrier aircraft ambushed the Japanese fleet. For Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. Japan lost the core of its naval aviation. The Japanese advance was stopped. In North Africa, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery faced Rommel at El Alamein. In October, after a massive artillery barrage, the British launched an offensive that broke the Axis line. Rommel retreated westward. The Desert War turned. In November, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. Axis forces in North Africa were caught between two armies. In the east, the struggle reached its most brutal phase. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. The battle for Stalingrad became a nightmare of rubble and blood. German and Soviet troops fought room to room, floor to floor, cellar to cellar. The city was turned into a graveyard. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. German flanks were smashed. The Sixth Army was surrounded. For months, German troops fought in freezing ruins, supplied only by air. Starvation, disease, and Soviet artillery destroyed them. In February 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered. More than 300,000 men were lost. Stalingrad became the greatest defeat in German history. The myth of German invincibility died in the ruins of the city. From that moment onward, the war began to turn against the Axis. In the Pacific, American forces halted the Japanese advance at Guadalcanal. After months of brutal jungle fighting, Japan withdrew. In Europe, Allied bombers launched a massive campaign against German cities and industries. Hamburg burned in firestorms. The Ruhr was devastated. Oil refineries and factories were reduced to rubble. German production struggled to keep up. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army began to advance. German forces were driven out of the Caucasus. Ukraine became the next battlefield. In the summer of 1943, Germany launched its last great offensive at Kursk. It failed. The Red Army crushed the German armored forces and seized permanent strategic initiative. From that moment onward, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive in the East. The Axis powers were now fighting a defensive war. Italy collapsed in 1943. Mussolini was overthrown. Allied forces landed in Sicily and then on the Italian mainland. German troops rushed south to hold the line. The Mediterranean became another front. By the end of 1943, the war had entered its final phase. The Axis powers still fought fiercely. Their armies were experienced and dangerous, but they were now outnumbered, outproduced, and outmaneuvered. The world was moving toward the final reckoning. By 1944, the war had entered its final, brutal stage. The Axis powers were retreating on every front, but they were far from defeated. Germany still controlled most of Europe. Japan still held vast territories across Asia and the Pacific. Millions of soldiers remained under arms. Entire cities were turned into fortresses. The end of the war would not come quickly, and it would not come cheaply. In the West, Britain and the United States prepared the largest amphibious invasion in history. For 2 years, Allied planners had worked in secret. Thousands of ships were assembled. Millions of tons of supplies were stockpiled. Entire armies trained along the southern coast of England. The goal was clear: open a second front in Western Europe and drive straight into the heart of Nazi Germany. To deceive the Germans, the Allies launched an enormous deception campaign. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and inflatable aircraft were deployed across England. A phantom army under General George Patton was created on paper, complete with fake headquarters and false operational plans. German intelligence was convinced that the main invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais. The real target was Normandy. On the night of June 5, 1944, more than 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Gliders crashed into fields and hedgerows. Bridges were seized. Roads were cut. At dawn on June 6, Allied troops stormed the beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword. The German Atlantic Wall, built over 4 years, was breached in a single day. Thousands of men died in the surf. Entire units were cut down by machine gun fire. But by nightfall, the Allies had secured their foothold. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. In the east, the Red Army launched its own colossal offensive. Operation Bagration, unleashed in June 1944, shattered the German Army Group Center. Soviet forces smashed through German lines in Belarus, encircled entire armies, and destroyed more than 30 German divisions. Minsk fell. Vilnius fell. The German front collapsed. Within weeks, the Red Army stood at the gates of Warsaw. The Wehrmacht was being destroyed faster than it could be rebuilt. Across France, Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy. The Bocage country turned into a deadly maze of hedgerows and narrow lanes. German defenders fought stubbornly. Progress was slow and costly. In July, American forces broke through at Saint-Lô. Operation Cobra opened the road to Paris. German forces in Normandy were trapped in the Falaise pocket. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. The rest fled eastward in chaos. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds flooded the streets. Church bells rang. Tricolor flags reappeared from hiding. After 4 years of occupation, the French capital was free. The Allies advanced rapidly across France and Belgium. Brussels was liberated. Antwerp was captured intact, providing a vital supply port. But the German army was not finished. In December 1944, Hitler launched a final gamble. Through the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, German armored divisions smashed into the thinly held American lines. The offensive created a massive bulge in the Allied front. Entire units were surrounded. Towns changed hands repeatedly. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was encircled. When the German commander demanded surrender, the American reply was one word: nuts. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States Army. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. The Wehrmacht had exhausted its last strategic reserves. The road to Germany lay open. In the east, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. Soviet forces smashed through German defenses in Poland and advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. Warsaw was liberated. Krakow was liberated. The Red Army reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. Germany was now surrounded. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine. Cologne fell. Frankfurt fell. The Ruhr industrial region was encircled, trapping hundreds of thousands of German troops. The Allied armies advanced toward the heart of the Reich. In April 1945, the final battle began. The Battle of Berlin. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers attacked the German capital. The city had been transformed into a fortress. Anti-tank guns were placed in intersections. Hitler Youth manned barricades. Old men and boys were issued rifles. The Red Army advanced street by street. Buildings were blasted apart by artillery. Entire blocks burned. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Inside the Führer bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler faced the end. On April 30th, 1945, he committed suicide. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. On May 7th, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Across the world, however, the war still raged. In the Pacific, American forces fought island by island toward Japan. The battles were among the most savage of the war. At Iwo Jima, nearly the entire Japanese garrison fought to the death. The island became a graveyard of volcanic ash and shattered bunkers. At Okinawa, Japanese forces launched massive kamikaze attacks against the American fleet. Thousands of sailors were killed. The fighting lasted 3 months. Japan showed no sign of surrender. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands was expected to cost millions of lives. In August 1945, the United States unleashed a new weapon. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The city was destroyed in seconds. On August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, crushing the Japanese Guandong Army in days. Japan was faced with total destruction. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered. The Second World War was over. It had lasted 6 years. It had killed more than 70 million people. Entire cities lay in ruins. Empires had fallen. New superpowers had risen. The world had been transformed forever. The war ended, but its legacy would shape the future of humanity for generations. The world had survived the greatest catastrophe in its history. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of the Second World War continued to reverberate across the planet. The conflict that had engulfed Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific had finally ended, leaving in its wake a world transformed by unprecedented destruction, unimaginable loss, and a profound reckoning with the consequences of total war. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Millions more were displaced, homeless, and wandering across a shattered continent. Entire economies had collapsed, and the old world order had crumbled along with the empires that had once dominated it. Europe, the epicenter of the conflict, bore the brunt of the devastation. German cities like Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were leveled by bombing campaigns and artillery barges. The countryside was littered with the wreckage of tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles abandoned in retreat. Poland, once vibrant and industrial, was a wasteland of destroyed towns and cities. Warsaw, having endured both the initial Nazi occupation and the devastating uprising of 1944, was left in smoldering ruins. The Soviet Union, while victorious, had suffered catastrophic losses. Tens of millions of civilians and soldiers had perished, and entire regions were stripped bare. Cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad, though liberated and rebuilt, bore permanent scars from years of siege, bombardment, and occupation. Amid the ruins, human suffering was profound. Refugees and displaced persons filled the streets, seeking shelter, food, and news of missing family members. Millions of children wandered orphaned. Starvation and disease threatened survivors, especially in areas where infrastructure had collapsed completely. International aid was slow to arrive. Relief agencies, still struggling to rebuild their own operations after years of conflict, were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of need. Camps were established for displaced persons, but conditions were often dire. The Cold War had not yet begun, but already, tensions simmered between former allies, hinting at the ideological struggle that would soon dominate the latter half of the 20th century. The human toll of the war was staggering. It is estimated that over 70 million people perished, including soldiers and civilians alike. The Holocaust alone claimed 6 million Jewish lives, as well as millions of Romani, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and others targeted by the Nazi regime. Cities, towns, and entire cultural landmarks were destroyed, erasing centuries of history. Economies that had once thrived were reduced to rubble, and industrial centers lay silent across Europe and Asia. The scale of destruction forced the international community to confront the need for a new framework to preserve peace. The United Nations was formed in 1945, an organization intended to prevent another global catastrophe by fostering dialogue and cooperation among nations. Its charter reflected lessons learned from the failures of the League of Nations, and it was built on principles of collective security, human rights, and international law. The war crimes tribunals at Nuremberg and later Tokyo sought to bring justice to those responsible for the crimes of the Axis powers. High-ranking Nazi officials were prosecuted for crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. In Tokyo, Japanese military and political leaders faced similar trials for atrocities committed in China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories. These trials set precedents for international law and established that individuals, not just states, could be held accountable for mass atrocities. Economically, the Marshall Plan in Western Europe and reconstruction efforts in the Soviet-occupied East aimed to rebuild shattered societies. Germany was divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Japan, under the supervision of General Douglas MacArthur, underwent sweeping reforms, democratization, and demilitarization. Railroads, factories, and ports were rebuilt. Education systems were restructured. New constitutions sought to ensure that such devastation could never happen again. Yet the victory also set the stage for a new conflict. The wartime alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union began to unravel almost immediately. Ideological differences between capitalism and communism, combined with the competition for influence in Europe and Asia, created the seeds of the Cold War. Germany, divided and occupied, became the front line of this new struggle. Berlin, once a symbol of Nazi power, became the epicenter of espionage, tension, and confrontation between East and West. Culturally, the war left an indelible mark on societies around the world. Survivors recounted experiences that would define generations: the horrors of concentration camps, the struggles of occupation, and the courage of those who resisted. Literature, art, and cinema began to grapple with these experiences, documenting stories of heroism, suffering, and survival. Monuments and memorials were erected in countless cities, honoring both the military and civilian victims. These memorials served as a reminder that history must not repeat itself and that the consequences of total war are felt long after the last shot has been fired. Technologically, the war accelerated scientific advancement. Jet engines, radar, computing machines, and nuclear energy had all been developed or refined during the conflict. The Manhattan Project in the United States culminated in the first nuclear bombs, demonstrating both the destructive power and the potential of modern science. Nuclear weapons would soon define the post-war era, introducing a new form of strategic deterrence and profoundly shaping international relations. In Asia, Japan faced occupation and reconstruction under Allied supervision. The Japanese people endured food shortages, political restructuring, and the aftermath of two atomic bombings. Yet by the early 1950s, Japan had begun to recover, laying the foundations for what would become a technological and economic powerhouse. Similarly, China, devastated by years of Japanese occupation and civil war, faced internal struggle as the Communist Party under Mao Zedong consolidated power, setting the stage for the political landscape of the Cold War. The legacy of the Second World War extended beyond borders. Refugees, displaced populations, and survivor communities scattered across continents. Jewish survivors migrated to Palestine, contributing to the creation of Israel. Many Europeans emigrated to the Americas and Australia, seeking safety and opportunity. These movements reshaped demographics, politics, and societies in profound ways. Education, commemoration, and historical scholarship became critical in preserving the memory of the war. Schools across the world began teaching the history of the conflict in detail. Archives were established, war diaries and testimonies collected, and the experiences of veterans documented. These efforts ensured that the lessons of the war, both the heroism and the horrors, would not be forgotten. Despite the devastation, the world began to rebuild. Nations sought to create structures that could prevent future global conflicts. International cooperation, economic integration, and the establishment of human rights frameworks became central to post-war reconstruction. The experience of the Second World War shaped foreign policy, military strategy, and diplomatic relations for decades to come. The Second World War was more than a military conflict. It was a catalyst that reshaped politics, society, and culture on a global scale. Its aftermath set the stage for the modern world, illustrating the consequences of total war, the capacity for human resilience, and the importance of remembering history to prevent future catastrophe.